Story 1. Around 17 years ago, my life took an unexpected turn when I became entangled in a complex situation. I became involved in an affair with the wife of a pastor who owned a large Pentecostal megachurch. What made it even more complicated was the fact that she and I shared a dark secret, something that, if exposed, could become headline news. Consequently, I had to exercise extreme caution and conceal many details to avoid detection. My journey began when I was 16 years old, moving into yet another foster home. It was not the first time I had experienced this upheaval. Following my grandmother's passing, I had been shuffled from one foster home to another. Unfortunately, my mother had a severe drug problem, which had led to the state removing me from her custody shortly after my birth. They placed me with the closest responsible relative, who happened to be my maternal grandmother. Throughout my upbringing, I remained unaware of my father's identity. He could have been one of my mother's numerous boyfriends, but the truth remained a mystery. After my grandmother's passing meant my mother was unable to reclaim me for two primary reasons. Firstly, her whereabouts were not easily traceable, and secondly, she continued to grapple with her pills obsession. Growing up in foster care proved to be a challenging journey. With each move to a new home, I encountered a fresh set of difficulties, but I consistently made an effort to adapt to my changing circumstances. Thus, I found myself navigating the foster care system, transitioning from one foster household to another. This time around, I ended up under the care of a couple in their early 50s, a married duo who had previously raised their own children, all of whom had grown up and moved out. Their residence was a spacious 5-bedroom house, accommodating approximately 7 kids, myself included. In contrast to my prior experiences, this couple, despite their parenting background, approached foster care with a unique perspective. They maintained a disciplined and professional demeanor, treating foster parenting more like a business endeavor. Although they occasionally displayed compassion, their approach was rooted in pragmatism. They refrained from forming strong attachments, recognizing that children often came and went in their household. This dynamic was markedly different from what I had grown accustomed to. Living with them came with its own set of challenges. Their home was well organized, governed by a set of strict rules. They ran a tight ship, ensuring that everyone carried out their assigned chores and fulfilled their responsibilities. On occasion, it felt as though I was residing in a structured environment rather than a nurturing home filled with warmth and emotional attachment. Nevertheless, life continued, and I made an earnest effort to adapt to the established routines and regulations, striving to integrate into this new family dynamic. At the age of 16, I found myself as the eldest among the 7 boys residing in the foster home. The couple had devised a distinctive strategy aimed at maximizing their financial resources. Instead of expending funds on groceries, they directed us to seek assistance from soup kitchens and weekly pantries to procure our essential needs. This approach allowed them to avoid incurring food expenses, with their primary financial obligations limited to the mortgage and utility bills for the house. In essence, the couple was running a foster home as a profitable business venture, and we, the children in their care, were viewed more as sources of income rather than as children in need. Consequently, we lacked a personal connection with them, leading us to form stronger bonds amongst ourselves. Given that all the other children were younger than me, they naturally looked up to me, and I assumed a mentorship role. I guided them through their schoolwork, assisted with cooking, and ensured everyone fulfilled their assigned chores and responsibilities. Despite the unorthodox arrangement and the couple's business-oriented approach, we managed to establish a makeshift family among ourselves. In the absence of strong connections with our foster parents, we discovered support and camaraderie within our own group. As we continued to visit the local soup kitchen, I had the opportunity to meet a woman named Mrs. Carroll, a fictitious name used to protect her identity. At that time, she was 36 years old and frequently volunteered there alongside her husband James, who happened to be a local pastor. James, aged 42, and their 2 children, a 5-year-old boy and a 7-year-old boy, would accompany her on these occasions. Through these weekly encounters at the soup kitchen, I got to know Mrs. Carroll better. We would exchange pleasantries, and she came across as friendly and approachable. On a particular day, while she was performing her usual duties of serving meals, she encouraged me to consider volunteering earlier. She mentioned that they occasionally face challenges in finding enough volunteers. I readily agreed to volunteer and assured her that I'd arrive early for the next opportunity. Staying true to my word, I showed up promptly for the next volunteering session, even bringing along my foster brothers to assist. Our presence proved to be more than sufficient to help with their needs, and we eagerly contributed by serving meals and assisting with cleanup afterward. Being part of something positive was a rewarding experience, especially considering the difficulties we encountered in our foster home. Mrs. Carroll's kindness and the chance to give back to the community introduced a new dimension to my life. Mrs. Carroll struck me as an exceptionally kind person. She consistently wore a warm smile, and I valued the positive atmosphere she brought to our interactions. It wasn't until one day, after we had finished serving meals, that I discovered her husband James was a pastor. She extended an invitation to me and my brothers to attend one of their church services. At that point, I hesitated as I lacked any personal connection to religion and had never set foot in a church before. Nonetheless, I held a favorable opinion of Pentecostal churchgoers because they had consistently extended a helping hand to me throughout my life. Despite this, I remained uncertain about accepting Mrs. Carroll's persistent invitation. It took several more instances of volunteering at the soup kitchen before I had the opportunity to meet James, her husband. He appeared to take a liking to me, recognizing and appreciating my diligent efforts in cleaning up the kitchen. My energy and friendly demeanor earned his approval, although his pastoral duties kept him too occupied to volunteer regularly. Despite my initial reservations about attending their church, the positive experiences with Mrs. Carroll and James began to broaden my perspective, and their kindness made me contemplate giving it a chance. Eventually, I made the decision to go to the church with two of my brothers who were closer to my age. We felt somewhat out of place, dressed in our casual attire rather than the typical church garments. At that time, the church was not overly large, boasting a congregation of around 400-600 members, but it was sizable enough that we couldn't help but feel like conspicuous newcomers. During the church service, Mrs. Carroll was not visible until its conclusion. She was seated near the pulpit alongside her husband, Pastor James, and some church elders. Mrs. Carroll held the role of the primary church singer, and she demonstrated exceptional talent in that regard. Following the service, I took the initiative to approach her and exchange greetings. She displayed genuine delight upon seeing me, although our interaction was brief as she promptly shifted her focus to other congregation members. In the subsequent weeks, my thoughts often gravitated towards Mrs. Carroll. Her consistent kindness to my brothers and me left a lasting impression, and I eagerly anticipated any opportunity to encounter her. During our volunteer sessions at the soup kitchen, I frequently inquired if she required any assistance, hoping to engage in more conversations with her. Her presence had a captivating quality that left me feeling our connection was evolving beyond the occasional greetings we exchanged at the soup kitchen. One day, Mrs. Carroll confided in me about her recent family relocation. Unfortunately, the movers had overlooked some items, and she found herself in need of assistance. As her husband, Pastor James, was occupied with his pastoral duties, she wondered if I could offer a helping hand. I readily agreed to help. Following the closure of the soup kitchen, one of my brothers and I accompanied Mrs. Carroll and her children in her car to her new residence, conveniently located not far from the soup kitchen. During the car ride, we engaged in conversation, and I shared my life story as a foster child with no knowledge of my biological parents. Mrs. Carroll expressed empathy for my circumstances and inquired about my aspirations. I revealed my dream of pursuing a career in music and recounted my previous involvement with friends in learning to play musical instruments, which had faded due to my lack of a cell phone or internet access. Sharing my dreams and challenges with Mrs. Carroll felt oddly comforting. She attentively listened, and her genuine concern fostered a connection I had never experienced before. Following our assistance with the move, Mrs. Carroll pleasantly surprised me by taking me to Walmart and purchasing a Nokia cell phone for me. It was a prepaid phone that allowed calls, text messaging, and even internet browsing. I was elated. It felt akin to getting my first car, opening up a whole new world of possibilities. With my newfound phone, I added contacts, including some friends. However, the person I found myself frequently texting was Mrs. F. Carroll. This occurred during a time when taking and sharing photos was a novel concept. Since platforms like Instagram didn't exist then, she would send me snapshots of her daily outfits or her attire before heading to the gym. I would frequently go above and beyond in expressing my admiration for her, showering her with an abundance of compliments about her cuteness and beauty. Although our interactions remained wholesome, I may have occasionally overindulged in my compliments. Mrs. Carroll appeared to derive enjoyment from our exchanges, often responding with new pictures, sometimes even twice a day. These exchanges gradually evolved into a daily routine, our shared secret, despite the absence of any inappropriate content. As I continued to send compliments and receive her pictures, my feelings for her began to deepen unexpectedly. Despite the innocuous nature of our conversations, an unanticipated connection was forming between us. Over time, what began as the exchange of daily outfit pictures with Mrs. Carroll took on a special significance. It felt as though she was confiding something personal exclusively with me, even though it revolved around her everyday clothing choices. Our regular texting continued, and my affection for her grew, particularly when we encountered each other during our volunteer work at the soup kitchen. Texting became our preferred mode of communication, and after each volunteering session, Mrs. T. Carroll started to share innocent hugs with me. While these embraces remained entirely pure and devoid of any romantic intent, they became the highlight of my day. The lingering fragrance of her perfume left a lasting impression, and I cherished this small yet meaningful connection. My thoughts began to revolve around her constantly, and I found myself developing a crush on her. To increase the frequency of my encounters with her, I decided to invest the money I had saved in purchasing a jacket. This would enable me to attend her church regularly, since volunteering events alone were no longer sufficient to see her. One day, as she sent me a picture, I chose to convey something I hadn't expressed before, labeling the image as attractive. Ordinarily, after complimenting her, she would respond with gratitude. However, on this occasion, there was an unsettling silence that made me anxious, fearing I had made a mistake. To exacerbate matters, she refrained from sending any more pictures for 2 days, seemingly confirming my apprehensions about crossing a boundary. Feeling uneasy about my earlier comment, I decided to offer a personal apology to Mrs. Carroll when I encountered her at the soup kitchen the following week. In a moment of privacy, away from the ears of others, I sincerely expressed regret for my previous statement. To my relief, she appeared unaffected and regarded me as if I were overreacting. She asserted her comfort with the remark, though her body language suggested otherwise. Her demeanor towards me wasn't as warm as it had been. Curiously, the following day, she shared another picture of herself. I distinctly remember texting her, "You are incredibly attractive. I wish you were mine." Once again, she refrained from offering thanks, but continued to send additional pictures. On this occasion, her attire seemed somewhat more revealing than usual, suggesting it was unlikely she would wear such an outfit in public. I complimented her on her appealing appearance, and from that moment on, the pictures she shared gradually became more alluring. However, they never fully disclosed too much or involved nudity, always leaving a lot to the imagination. It became evident that she relished the attention and admiration I directed her way. Since I regularly encountered her children at the soup kitchen, we formed a close bond, and I spent a lot of time playing with them, getting to know them well. On one occasion, she requested if I could babysit her kids while she and her husband had to attend an event, to which I agreed. I engaged in enjoyable games of hide and seek with her children, and upon her return they compensated me. At that time it held significant value for me since I didn't have a job. I promptly utilized the money to purchase clothing that better suited my taste, as the ones provided by my foster parents did not align with my preferences. We grew closer, and on occasion she would send me playful and flirtatious pictures that hinted at something more intimate without explicitly revealing anything. In response, I would express my desires, sharing my wish that she were mine and detailing what I envisioned. However, she never replied with words, and we never broached the subject in our conversations. It remained an unspoken aspect of our text messages. During one of my babysitting sessions, after her return home, we engaged in a game of hide and seek with her kids. As the youngest child was tasked with finding everyone, I concealed myself behind the closet door in the darkness. Unsure if she couldn't find a hiding spot or simply wanted to join me, Mrs. and Carol decided to share my hiding place. With her back pressed against me, we stood there, unable to ignore the romantic tension that had been steadily building for months. My desire for physical contact with her grew, and I began to initiate it. She eventually turned around, and we passionately kissed and explored each other's desires. Our interlude concluded abruptly when her children called out to us. As I pedaled my bicycle homeward, a profound sense of happiness washed over me as I savored the cherished memories. Subsequently, she ceased sending pictures, and I refrained from texting her until she requested my babysitting assistance the following week. Upon her return, she treated her children to pizza. While they dined, we discreetly retired to the bedroom and engaged in an intimate encounter, marking my inaugural sexual experience. Henceforth, she initiated contact via text, and I would promptly ride to her residence, even in the absence of babysitting duties. Behind closed doors, we shared intimate moments, occasionally remaining in bed, engaged in conversation. She implored me to maintain discretion, urging me not to disclose our relationship to my friends, siblings, or anyone else. A profound connection blossomed between us, and she divulged that her husband adhered to strict preferences in the bedroom, favoring only missionary positions and perpetually occupied with his duties. Our intimacy occurred at a minimum of 3 instances each week. Despite the potential for guilt, given my involvement with a married woman, especially one wedded to a pastor, I remained apathetic to the moral implications. I believed I was in love. My preoccupation with her reached a point where I yearned to linger in her embrace all night, engaged in conversation, instead of returning home. Unfortunately, I had to depart when her husband was due to return. Our encounters gradually became less frequent, occurring approximately twice a week. Fast forward about a year later. I had secured a job as a cashier, and the babysitting responsibilities diminished in both frequency and duration. Throughout our liaisons, she had never broached the topic of using protection. Then, one fateful day, during an intimate moment, our lapse in locking the door led to her son inadvertently walking in on us, catching us red-handed. It remained unclear just how aware he was, though he appeared to be a discerning child. We were left in uncertainty about the duration of his presence, prompting us to hastily cover ourselves. She anxiously urged me to leave, and her demeanor was fraught with panic. This incident marked the first time we were caught, and it happened nearly a year into our clandestine relationship. Subsequently, she began distancing herself. The exchange of pictures and invitations ceased. My attempts to reach her at the soup kitchen were met with a declaration that we should terminate our involvement. I couldn't move on, persistently texting her and appearing at the soup kitchen. Eventually, she ceased attending altogether, leaving me with a profound sense of abandonment and emotional turmoil. For days I grieved in secret, tears silently streaming down my cheeks, regarding the pictures she had sent me with a sense of longing, convinced that I was in love. A week after our parting, I decided to visit her church, yearning for even the briefest glimpse of her. This was approximately a month following our breakup, and to my surprise, I learned she was pregnant. At that juncture, it didn't occur to me that I might be the father. Rather, I experienced a sense of relief, believing her absence was due to the pregnancy rather than her abandoning me like others in my life. I returned home and concentrated on my work and education. Upon graduating from high school, I left the foster home to enlist in the Navy. During my tenure in the Navy around 2005, I began to entertain the possibility of being the father of her child. Regrettably, I lacked the means to investigate further. I deduced that her husband was unlikely to be the father, as she had intimated that their intimacy was limited. She even conveyed that I had shared more intimate moments with her than her husband had. Following my military service, thoughts of her gradually receded as I embarked on world travels and engaged in relationships with various women. Eventually, I married a Japanese woman and brought her to the United States once my business flourished. Recently, I sought her out on Facebook and discovered that she remains with her husband, actively engaged in church activities, and their congregation has expanded. She is now the mother of 4 children, and when I examine the features of the 3rd child, I cannot help but detect a resemblance to my own. However, I have no intention of disrupting their lives by divulging this information. Doing so could potentially devastate not only her life but mine as well. It feels like one of those secrets that will remain buried with me. What do you advise I do in this situation? My wife and I tied the knot 8 months ago, and now we have a little boy who's 19 months old. Our story started back in 2020 when we met and began dating casually. We took things slow and were good friends for quite a few months before things got more serious. The lockdown definitely had an impact on our early relationship because we could only meet up a handful of times. But as soon as the restrictions were lifted, our bond grew stronger and we became really close. Then came the unexpected news a few months later. She told me she was pregnant. Can you believe it? Just a few months into our relationship? Well, that's a big red flag, and you'll soon understand why. This news came as a complete shock, and I wasn't prepared for it. I mostly used protection, but there were a few times when I didn't. Oh, come on, man. While I mostly blamed myself, during those times she encouraged me and assured me it was safe based on her cycle. But never rely solely on a woman for birth control and don't trust the rhythm method. As this woman did. Lesson learned. Never assume anything when it comes to pregnancy. Despite my initial apprehensions, I was looking forward to becoming a father. She moved in with me, and I accompanied her to most of her doctor appointments. When the baby was born, we gave him my first and last name, even though we weren't married at the time. After living together for just under a year, I proposed, and we got married a month later. The wedding was low-key, with only close family and a few friends. We were deeply in love and crazy about our son. After her maternity leave, my wife returned to work, and my mom started looking after our son. Since I had a later start time at work, I usually dropped off the baby in the morning, and my wife picked him up after work. We often ended up having dinner with my parents because my mom loves to cook. Life felt perfect, but everything changed on Veterans Day. It was a company holiday, and we both had the day off. My wife and mother went shopping while I stayed home with the baby. While putting him down for a nap, I noticed her tablet on the dresser and decided to search for something on Google. I'd never used her tablet before, but she used the same password for everything, so I was able to get in without any issues. I didn't think twice about using her tablet since we openly shared each other's phones and our home computer. After my search, I thought I'd check Twitter and Facebook to catch up on the latest news. While waiting for my son to fall asleep, instead of logging into my accounts, I just used hers since she was already signed in. While scrolling through Facebook, I got curious and decided to sneak a peek at my wife's messages. I wasn't looking for trouble. I just wanted to see what she was chatting about, a bit of harmless snooping. Her recent messages were pretty mundane, mostly short exchanges with me, her friends, family, and a few co-workers. She's not the type to delete messages, so there were thousands of them, dating all the way back to when she first joined the platform. My curiosity led me to backtrack to when we first connected, hoping to find the very first message she sent me. I was also interested in seeing what she was sharing with her friends about me during those early days. It didn't take long to find those messages, and it brought back some sweet memories. I kept on reading and was amused by what she had to say about me. But then I stumbled upon a peculiar conversation between her and a Facebook user whose name I didn't recognize. As I read their exchanges, I pieced together the identity of this person. Turns out he's a colleague at her workplace, and not just any colleague, he's a senior manager. and she works under him and 2 other managers in an administrative role. What raised suspicions was that he was using a fake account to communicate with her. While I hadn't personally known him, I had met him and his wife at their company events like Christmas parties and picnics. His wife even held our son at the last company picnic. Little did I know that this seemingly innocent act would soon reveal a dark secret about my wife. As I delved deeper into their messages, I was hit with a devastating revelation. My wife had been involved in a physical affair with this man for quite some time. From what I gathered, it had begun several months before we even met, and continued for several months afterward. The pain of this realization was unbearable, and I have to admit, I cried like a baby while sitting beside my son's crib. But the worst was yet to come. As I read further, I stumbled upon a set of messages where they discussed her pregnancy. My heart sank when I saw a message in which he asked her whose baby it was, and she replied that she wasn't sure. It was like a punch in the gut, and I felt nauseated. The idea that my son might not be mine was inconceivable. I couldn't believe what I was reading, and I wanted to scream and punch the wall right then and there. In his next message, he suggested that she should consider getting a termination, just to be safe, since she was unsure of the child's paternity. He told her that the company's insurance would cover it, and I would never have to find out. My wife responded, saying she couldn't do that. He followed up somewhat ominously, stating that it was her decision, but he didn't want any trouble down the road if the child turned out to be his. He made it clear that he had no intention of divorcing his wife and warned her not to even think about it. She didn't respond, and that marked the end of their communication. There wasn't any other message exchange between them that I could find. All these messages date back to 2020, with the last one being over 2 years ago, right before she revealed she was pregnant. It's pretty evident she trapped me with a child that might not even be mine. That's the cold, hard truth of the matter. It seems like she was head over heels for her boss and possibly intentionally got pregnant, thinking it would tie him to her and he'd eventually leave his wife for her. Well, it's clear he wasn't up for that plan. So when she realized her dream guy wasn't taking the bait, she thought, okay, what's plan B? Oh, let's cling to this nice guy I've been dating. That's what I suspect went down. I felt like a complete fool. I'm not entirely sure why she didn't delete those messages, but I'm darn glad she didn't. Maybe she had some devious plan to use them against him someday. Who knows? As I watched my son sleep, my emotions shifted from deep sadness to intense anger as I contemplated what she had done to us. I considered confronting her with my mother present as soon as they got back, but then I thought maybe I should have all my ducks in a row before doing that. When they eventually returned, I tried to act as normal as possible, but my mom noticed something was off with me and asked if I was coming down with something. I assured her it was nothing, just a bit tired from chasing after our little whirlwind all day. She chuckled and mentioned how exhausting he could be, completely buying my story. The next day at work, I found it hard to concentrate because my mind was preoccupied with what I needed to do. The top priority on my list was getting a DNA test, so I scheduled an appointment for later that week. On the appointed day, I took some time off and swung by my parents' place to pick up my son. My mom seemed surprised to see me. I explained that I had a few errands to run for work and thought my son would enjoy a car ride. My mom's got a pretty good BS detector, but she accepted my explanation, and off we went. In the days that followed, I was a wreck, anxiously waiting for the DNA test results. The day I received the report was the absolute worst day of my life, even worse than the day I discovered her affair. I'll never forget the dreadful feeling that washed over me when I opened the report and saw the negative results. It was as if a dagger had pierced straight through my chest, and I felt like I'd been dealt a blow by the devil himself. The rest of that day turned into a blur, my thoughts racing in a million different directions. Immediately, I knew I couldn't continue being married to her after what she had done. However, I grappled with what to do about my son. I loved him just as much as before, but I have to admit, knowing he wasn't biologically mine started to change how I saw him. I didn't treat him any differently, but it altered my perspective. I didn't feel comfortable sharing my dilemma with anyone, so I had to sort through my feelings on my own. I decided it was crucial to take some time to ponder everything thoroughly before making a decision. I kept up the facade of acting normally, but with each passing day it became increasingly challenging. Eventually I came to the conclusion that the best course of action for both my son and me would be for me to step away. I realize that letting him go will be incredibly painful, but I genuinely believe it's the right thing to do. Even though I love him more than anything, our relationship will never be the same, especially once I divorce his mother. Here's what I mean by that. In all likelihood, both my soon-to-be ex and I will find new partners and potentially have more children in the future. When that happens, my son would have 3 fathers in his life. Think about it. He'd have his biological father, his stepfather, and then me, the guy who was deceived into marrying his mother. Imagine the complications that would bring for him and everyone involved. If I step away now, he might forget about me in a few months, and we could spare everyone from such a tangled web of relationships. So, after numerous sleepless nights, I consulted with an attorney and set things in motion. He explained that since we had been married for less than a year and the marriage was based on deception, I could pursue an annulment. It would essentially erase the marriage as if it never happened, which sounded like the best option to me. When it came to my son, the attorney told me that, based on the evidence I provided, there was a high likelihood of success in my case. However, he looked me in the eyes and asked if that's genuinely what I wanted. I replied affirmatively, but then emotions welled up and I felt tears forming in my eyes. He understood the emotional turmoil I was going through and suggested I go home and sleep on it one more night before making the final decision. He emphasized that, while the legal route could provide closure, it could also mean my son would be entirely removed from my life. He shared stories of other men he had represented in similar situations, noting that many struggled with the emotional aftermath because they weren't mentally prepared for it. I thanked him and left, feeling completely drained emotionally. I drove around aimlessly, trying to make sense of everything, and then eventually returned home to spend the evening playing with my son. When he finally dozed off in my arms, I carefully placed him in his crib. As I watched him sleeping peacefully, tears welled up, and I couldn't hold back my emotions. Fortunately, my wife didn't hear my tears. Later she came looking for me and found me lying on top of our bed. I pretended to be asleep, and she gave me a gentle kiss on the lips, unaware of the turmoil within me. While she kissed me, all I could think was, "You deceitful woman, you're acting as if everything's fine, like you've done nothing wrong." That night I tossed and turned, getting barely an hour of sleep. Thoughts of my son haunted me, and I started questioning my decisions, including the choice to divorce. I wondered if in 20 years any of this would even matter. Would I regret my choices on my deathbed? Ultimately, I resolved to stick with my original plan. The next morning, I called my attorney and informed him that I wanted to proceed with the divorce and paternity filings. He assured me he'd start working on it, but mentioned it might take a couple of weeks to get everything in order. In the meantime, he advised me to continue living in our home and maintain a facade of normalcy until the paperwork was ready. A few days have passed since then, and I've been struggling immensely. The thought of walking away from my son tears me apart. I dread that day, but at the same time, I can't wait to put this chapter of my life behind me. Update. 3 weeks have passed since my last update. I'm currently sitting here, watching the sun go down in Playa El Zante, El Salvador, and reflecting on my life. I thought it would be a good time to share what's been happening. About a week after my previous post, my attorney completed all the necessary paperwork for my divorce and paternity filings. With everything prepared, it was time to put my plan into motion. My first step was to have a heart-to-heart conversation with my parents. To say they were devastated would be an understatement. They were both deeply affected, especially my mom, who has been a significant part of my son's life. While they expressed their full support, my mom did ask if there was any way I could find it in my heart to continue being a part of my son's life. I told her I would love to, but the situation had become too complicated. I reiterated the reasons I mentioned in my original post, and my parents respected my decision. It's great to have their support, and even though they had some initial reservations, they seem to understand that this is the best course of action for all involved parties. I explained that I would be moving all my personal belongings to their house and would stay with them until I found a new place. I also shared my plan to confront my wife at our apartment when she came home that evening. I wanted both of my parents to be there to ensure things didn't escalate and to look after the baby. During the confrontation, I didn't beat around the bush. I confronted her directly about her affair with her boss, which left her stunned and in tears. She started explaining, and I assured her she would have plenty of time to speak. However, I had more to say. I handed her the DNA test results, revealing that I wasn't the biological father of our son. Her reaction was intense. She screamed no and buried her face in a couch pillow crying. I let her cry without saying a word for what felt like an eternity. Eventually, she sat up, apologizing and insisting that I was our son's one and only father. I corrected her, stating that I wasn't. She pleaded with me not to say that. That's when I handed her a folder containing the divorce agreement and a petition to disestablish paternity. Her reaction was loud and emotional. She threw the folder on the floor and continued crying. She begged me not to leave them and asked for a chance to explain. I told her the floor was hers and I was willing to listen. Instead of engaging in conversation, she excused herself and headed to the bathroom to grab a tissue. She spent a good 15 minutes in there before I became concerned and decided to check on her. She assured me she'd be out shortly, but it took another 10 minutes before she finally emerged. This is another example of someone being caught off guard and needing time to come up with excuses or what to say next. When she finally emerged, she wasn't in tears anymore. Instead, she expressed deep remorse and acknowledged that the affair was a terrible mistake. She claimed that she ended the affair around the time we became serious, although there was some overlap. She maintained that she had been completely faithful to me ever since, including throughout our marriage. I told her that I believed her, but it didn't change the fact that she had cheated and the child wasn't biologically mine. She then admitted that she wasn't 100% sure I was the father back then, but felt strongly that I was. She tried to shift the conversation, saying that it didn't matter if I was the biological father or not. She argued that our son loved me more than anyone else and pleaded with me not to leave him. It was clear she was trying to guilt-trip me into staying. I had anticipated this and stood my ground despite her tears and begging. She was emotionally distraught, and my mother ended up spending the next 3 nights with her and the baby until her own mother arrived. I too was emotionally drained and needed some distance from the situation, so I took some time off from work and decided to come here against my parents' wishes. They were concerned about my fragile mental state, but I assured them I'd be okay, and being away has helped clear my mind. My soon-to-be ex has been bombarding me with calls and texts, but I haven't engaged in conversation. I've replied to a few of her texts, and she's been pleading with me to stay. While I do feel some sadness for her, I've remained firm in my decision not to waver. Currently, both of my legal cases have been filed, and I'm waiting for a court date. I do feel a sense of relief, but I'm missing my son terribly, and that pain is still very raw. However, with each passing day, I'm gradually starting to feel a bit better. 2 days later, just wanted to quickly touch base and address a question I've been getting a lot about: why I chose to move down here. I needed a break from everything. Plus, this place is the first country to make Bitcoin official currency. I got into Bitcoin way back in 2012, snagging my first batch for less than $1.10 each. I ended up selling most of them in 2017 when they hit $4,200 each, which helped me wipe out my student loans, credit card bills, and even pay off my folks' house. I also treated myself to a couple of new rides, invested a good chunk in mutual funds, and took a break from school to explore Europe for a year. So yeah, I made a pretty penny from that move. But get this, Bitcoin's price soared to over $42,000 recently. Just imagine the fortune I'd have now if I just hung on to them a bit longer. At the time, I thought I was the king of finance. But looking back, I kinda kicked myself because I could have been sitting on a mountain of cash if I just waited a few more years. Still, I've done pretty well for myself, and I've got a few bitcoins left in my pocket. Not enough to quit working forever, but I'm getting there. Update: 10 months later. The annulment and paternity challenge cases are all wrapped up, and I've officially cleared all my marital commitments. I've embarked on a new job that has me splitting my time between the United States and El Salvador. During one of my visits to El Salvador earlier this year, I completely fell in love with the place. It was during that trip that I had an unexpected encounter with the CEO of a blockchain company while chilling at the beach bar. Our casual chat turned into a long discussion, and the very next day, he extended an invitation to tour their office. During my visit to their office, I had the chance to meet some of their employees and chat with their HR manager. In a nutshell, they offered me a job right there on the spot. I didn't jump on it immediately due to my personal circumstances and some uncertainty about living in a foreign country. Plus, I still had my beloved job back home. The CEO, being understanding, told me they'd be open to me working remotely from the United States as long as I spent a few weeks down in El Salvador every quarter. He advised me to head home, mull it over, and give him a call in a few days. Once I got back home, I had a heart-to-heart with my parents. They supported my decision, although they had concerns about me working abroad. There was also the worry that I might be running away from my problems, but I assured them that wasn't the case. Ultimately, I made the call to take the job 5 months ago, and I'm absolutely loving it. Now I'm back in El Salvador, and with each visit, I feel more connected to the place. In fact, I'm seriously considering making it my primary residence, especially with all the craziness going on back in the States. The people in El Salvador are incredibly positive and forward-looking. Now back to my personal life. Before my divorce, my wife made every effort to change my mind. I genuinely believe she loved me and was sincere, but the damage was too deep, and there was no way to salvage our relationship. Interestingly, after I started my new job, the intense hatred I held towards her seemed to vanish. She noticed this, and strangely it seemed to upset her more than when I was angry with her. She could tell that I had moved on. As for her son, that's been the most challenging aspect, but even that has turned out okay. My mom still looks after him, and I've dropped by a few times to have lunch with him when he's been there. However, he needs to be cautious about this. While his mom and my parents really love the child, maintaining that connection with him can be tricky. The first time I saw him after several months, his eyes lit up, and he gave me a big kiss and hug. He still remembers me, but I think he sees me now as just a nice guy and not his dad. He's an incredible kid, and I'll always cherish the me now as just a nice guy and not his dad. He's an incredible kid, and I'll always cherish the bye.